Hi, I'm Paloma, and this is my grandpa John.
Right. I'm the Grandpa John that is here. Really looking forward to our talk together.
Me too. So, you are related to Eleanor Roosevelt and FDR, right?
I am, as are you.
Yeah. And you are Eleanor Roosevelt's and FDR's grandson,
Yes.
and I'm their great granddaughter.
Yeah.
And yeah, what did you call them?
What did I
What were your
call?
names for them?
I called I called my grandfather Papa, and my name for my grandmother was Grandmére. The
Grandmère.
Grandmère, the French word for grandmother. And it was French, I think, because she learned French almost before she learned English. She had governesses or caretakers who took care of her when she was very young, all of whom were French. So it was very easy for her to pick up French, and when I knew her, she could speak French like a native.
And when you were just sitting with them, did did you feel like you were talking to the First Lady and the President of the United States, or was it just grandparents?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. It was at first my mother and I, that'd be your grandmother, I guess.
Mhm.
But my mother and I moved to the White House when my father went to serve in World War II. So that was about 1941, and I lived in the White House with my mother and saw a lot of my grandfather. Um, and um, I didn't see a lot of my grandmother because I do remember her at holiday meals and things like that. But she was on the road all the time, traveling. So I didn't have a chance to as much chance to know her in those early years. But then I came to live with her in my college years on vacations. So I had about 4 years at the tail end of her life when I spent so much wonderful time with her.
Mhm. And like, what were they like? What were their personalities? What was it like to be around them? Were you
Oh,
always happy, or were you expecting philosophical conversations about upcoming events and presidency and
eh,
World War II?
yes. Or no, I should know because I was too young to really know much about World War II. And so my memories of my grandfather were really the kind of memories that you might remember from 1941 to 1945. So about 4 years. And what I was describing was that it was really fun to, you know that he couldn't walk. So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
but he had a very strong upper body. So he would lift me up in the air and at when he was in his bed in the morning, and he would read what we called the funny papers, the from like the cartoons from the
Yeah,
newspapers,
yeah.
and he would spread them out on his bed, and we would chuckle and just have a wonderful time. We swam together in the White House pool. Um, we just had a very informal and sweet time sharing. I used to go to the Oval Office, to the president's office when he didn't have a more important guest there. and he had a lot of toys on his desk. It's the same desk that our current president
Donald
has.
Trump.
Yeah, right, Donald Trump. So it was really a very special time. I saw movies in the White House movie theater. I felt like a director of movies. It was, and I got taken to nursery school by Secret Service agents
That
who
must
had,
have been so fun.
it was both fun and a little difficult because of course, Secret Service agents had to wear a gun, and I
Yeah.
remember the one then who took me to nursery school had a little trouble hiding his gun when he was surrounded by a bunch of 4, 5-year-old kids.
Yeah, so it was a little scary.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I heard that Teddy Roosevelt drank 40 cups of coffee a day.
Well, my God, I
I
can't imagine that.
I yeah, he
I
drank
had
40 cups of coffee a day.
40 cups. This was Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy
Teddy, yeah.
Roosevelt was my great uncle, and of course I didn't know him. He served as best man during the uh, the wedding of
He
my
walked
my
Eleanor Roosevelt down the aisle.
yes, yes, exactly.
People would say that Teddy Roosevelt wanted to be like the baby at every baby naming and the bride at every wedding. He wanted to be the
I
center.
remember that.
Yeah.
Yes, he was so full of energy. I
Mhm.
mean, you've read about him and I've read about him, but he just had a huge supply of energy. I don't know how much of that came from the 40 cups of coffee. But
Did Eleanor and Franklin have any things like daily traditions of drinking 40 cups of coffee? Maybe not that extreme. Um,
no, none of the habits that I remember from my grandparents were anything like that extraordinary. But but uh, but my during those early years, my grandfather had a habit of swimming a lot every day, and we would swim in the pool together.
it would help him get strong for his polio.
Yes, right, very helpful for polio. And my grandmother, of course, as I said, I knew in later years. So with her, um, what in the way of regular habits and tendencies, she loved to to share meals with friends and family. I mean, I remember her sitting at the head of the table, and we'd have some of my uncles of her children at one side, and there was a kids' table. And I thought, well, I really want to sit at the grown-ups table. But when I finally was promoted to the grown-ups table, I wanted to go back to much more interesting to be at the kids' table.
Yeah.
But there were lots
Um,
of things.
and your mom, like my great grandmother, was Anna, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
She married a Boettiger, which is like how we got this really hard to spell last name. How did Anna meet John Boettiger?
Say it again. How did I
How
do?
did Anna meet John Boettiger?
Oh, interesting story, which I'll condense. But he was a reporter, a self-taught reporter, taught himself to write journalism. And at the time, in 1932, when they met, he he had been assigned to cover the campaign for the presidency of what he knew only as that fascinating governor of the state of New York, Franklin Roosevelt. So he joined the press corps and the campaign on the campaign train. I mean, that when FDR was campaigning to become president the first year in 1932. And and my parents just fell in love. The sort of, kissing between cars and having a wonderful time. It's the kind of experience that that I think had reporters been the kind of reporters that exist today, and hungry for tidbits that they could reveal to all their readers, it could have it could have really been tough on FDR's campaign because it would have,
Yeah.
been sort of a scandal. But it
And,
didn't happen because my father, John Boettiger, was one of them, was a reporter himself and friends with other reporters. So they had the freedom of the train all to themselves.
and he was a Republican, I heard, when they met,
Well,
I
I don't,
think.
he wasn't, I think it's probably more accurate to say that he didn't really have politics. I mean,
Okay.
his own personal politics. He didn't think much about politics, except that I think he began to when,
Once he met Anna.
that's right, exactly. So when he then went and my parents married and they they lived at least part-time in the White House, and my older brother and sister were born. That was, of course, by then, my father got a real introduction to politics and loved being a political person.
Yeah. And when I'm sorry. So I think you were born in Seattle, right?
Yes. Well,
In Washington State.
yes, I
Uh,
was.
did you go, did you get to go and hang out at the White House? Like, do you have, like, what were your fun memories of being with FDR in a White House? And not a lot of kids from that young
Yes,
can experience that. Like,
right.
what were your games in the White House?
Oh boy, the thing I began with was that my grandfather taking me onto his lap and playing on his bed in the morning, and my freedom to go into the Oval Office and play on the floor. Um, and that was the kind of, I remember accompanying him on sort of short trips that he would take. He would go down to he would go to conferences in other countries. Uh, the last one I remember, because my mother went along with him, was in Yalta, in part of what was then the Soviet Union. And
Right.
so they, well, I don't know. Why don't you go ahead?
Well, I heard a story once where you were, so the White House didn't have an elevator before Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Well,
And,
yeah,
right? Because of his
yeah,
polio, he had to add it in.
yeah.
And you played in the elevator. Am I
Oh,
correct?
boy, are you correct? It was a fascinating machine for me. So what I learned because of this odd buzz when I was playing in the elevator was that somebody else needed it. And so I knew it was the second floor because the little button said two. And I went up to the second floor, the door opened, and there was my grandfather, Franklin Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And standing there, well, one would think they were impatient, but my grandfather was very sweet and said to me, Johnny, You must understand that the elevator really has other uses than the play that you experience it. We're happy to have you play in it, but when that buzzer goes off, you should make sure that you press whatever button is being pushed and come up and get us.
And um, so did you ever break anything in the White House? Any fancy glasses?
I don't remember. I remember in fictional accounts of the White House things being broken, including like China things and
Mhm.
some pretty expensive stuff. But I don't think I remember breaking anything. The only thing that almost broke was during a Thanksgiving dinner when we had a large family there for Thanksgiving, and my grandfather was carving the turkey at one end of the table, long table, and my grandmother was sitting next to him, and he looked down at me, being the youngest person there at the other end of the table, and he said, "Johnny, I bet you would like a drumstick." And I said, "Yes, Papa, I would love a drumstick." But boy, it came like by air freight. He just threw his arm back and heaved it at me, and all the way down the table. And 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 he did say, "Here it comes," but all I could do was to pull the napkin up over my head. And fortunately, his aim was so good that it fell right in the center of my napkin. But that's the only he was a wonderfully playful person. I think everybody else was a little shocked because there had been a butler who was standing there with a silver tray expecting to carry the drumstick down to me, but my grandfather had other ideas.
Yeah. Um, so other than knowing they were famous, when did you start to understand just how important your grandparents were to the course of the world and millions of
You
lives?
know, I think it was really later. I think I really lived through those 4 years in the White House um, without really understanding. Um,
How
I
old were you again for those?
was from age 2 to age 5, and during the World War II. And the thing that I remember is when I was in the hospital with an infection in my throat. Um, at the time that my grandfather died, and I heard it on the radio, but I was so young that I couldn't make sense of this when because the announcer said the president is dead in Warm Springs, Georgia, and I just couldn't. All I remember from that moment was a nurse ran into the to my room and turned off my radio
Mm,
so I wouldn't hear the news. She didn't understand that I'd already heard the news, but I couldn't make good sense of it. And it wasn't until the next day when my grandmother and my mother came to my room um, and explained to me that my grandpa had died, and we needed to give up the White House and to make room for the new president, Harry Truman. So that was a sad moment, but the times that were great pleasures were the time living and playing with him.
yeah.
Mm.
Um, so I heard that your grandmother would sometimes take you traveling
Yes,
with her after the war.
yes.
Do you have any good stories about you traveling with her?
I have some good stories about traveling with her. She loved to travel, and she would often take with her a few uh, of her grandchildren, and probably more. One other grandchild named Haven, and I were among them, and I remember moments which were both funny and a little embarrassing. For example, she took me. She wanted to show me some entertainment place in Paris, and so she made a reservation at a nightclub, and and being who she was, she was ushered to she and the rest of us were ushered to a table that was right next to the stage, where it turned out there when I was so close to the stage that my chair almost went up when the stage went up. But so um, it was what you would call dancing girls that 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 were dancing on the stage, and I thought, I'll bet my grandmother is really embarrassed by this. The young grandchildren seeing dancing girls prancing around on the stage, and so I looked over in her direction, and she was not embarrassed. She was asleep. she she just decided that it was time for her to check out, and it wasn't until we were ready to go that I think she came to herself and we were back together again. So we had lots of other episodes while traveling. I remember that she I was older. We both worked for the United Nations, not literally worked for, but we were advocates of the United Nations, and we were both active, me as a college student, she is sort of as Eleanor Roosevelt, and she would take us often on the trips that she made for the UN, and I remember a time traveling with her in Europe, that she would I'm thinking of her commitment to human rights and the times that she one time when I was going to a conference in the city of Berlin in Germany, and she was um, in Brussels in Belgium, and she called me on the phone and said, Johnny, I want you to come to lunch with me tomorrow. And I said, Grandmére, it's a long way from Berlin to Brussels. I don't know even how to get there. But she insisted. She said, I really want you, I'm having a special guest for lunch, and I want you to have lunch with us. So I said, okay, I'll make an effort. And so I got onto a relic of an airplane run by the Polish Airlines that took me from Berlin to Brussels. And the pilot, the plane kept going up and down and up and down and up and down, and I had no idea why, because the down was really almost on the ground. But he was looking for the airport in Brussels. He was Polish and he didn't understand either French or English, which were the only languages that would allow for guidance for him. So I was really relieved to arrive in Brussels and to see my grandmother and the special guest that she had. I wish you had known him during his years of performing. Was a singer named Harry Belafonte. He sang calypso songs and was such a really well-known singer, and she thought that I would enjoy his company, and I really did.
Yeah. And it's so nice of her to think of you with that. And now you still remember.
Yes. Uh,
And so I read about how Eleanor Roosevelt felt like she always wanted to listen to everyone. She wanted to like get out and talk to regular people.
yes.
Um, did she, and I've heard she needed to reply, she felt like she needed to reply to all the personal letters that she received from people
Mm,
just around America.
mm.
And when we were saying when you were traveling with her, did she ever just leave and go hang out with the people at the train station?
Yes, yes,
Did you
often.
get to see her talk to them or what?
She talked to them, and I mean, she really, she wanted, I don't think she really wanted to be a celebrity. I think she really wanted to be a, a person, a member of the public, like other people. And though her years as First Lady and then later her years with the United Nations, um, she when I think of her in those terms, I think of um, the times that she was tireless. And I remember traveling with her. She had more energy than anybody I'd ever known. So when my a cousin and I would travel with her, at the end of the day, we'd be exhausted. And she'd say, "Well, but you don't remember, I guess, that we have a dinner party to go to tonight." And it was still wonderful. But the times that we worked together for the United Nations were special times. Um, he my grandmother would come to board meetings of the American Association for the UN, and I would come too, um, and sit across the table from her, and I would notice that occasionally her head would drop slightly like this, and and it turned, and what I realized was that she was going to sleep in the middle of the meeting, and she'd heard so many meetings that it didn't interest her sometimes a lot, and so she would take cat naps, and and uh, and but I wouldn't say anything. I was probably, I think, the only one at the table who knew that she was sleeping because she was so skillful at hiding
Keeping
her.
awake while she was sleeping.
That's right. That's right. Oh,
Mm. And uh, so, and you were born about 6 years before the end of World War II, right? Six
what
years,
happened 6 years before?
the end of World War II.
Yeah, well, the end of World War II was after my grandfather had died, and and the war was still on, so it carried on afterwards. But by then we had moved to Phoenix, Arizona. My father and my mother and sister and brother and I, and we lived there in the desert outside of Phoenix, and my they started a newspaper because my father was basically a newspaper reporter at heart.
Yeah. And during World War II, when you got older, like how much of an impact do you think FDR made on getting the United States through World War II?
Oh, huge, Paloma. He his leadership all through the war. Well, and before the war, there was a Great Depression.
The Great
Uh,
Depression, yeah.
Yeah, so during the Depression, he really brought the United States out of depression. I mean, not only personally, but with the people that he brought as staff in the White House and to the various offices in government.
And I heard Eleanor was a huge part of that too. She would go into the coal mines, right?
Yes, there's a
The coal mine.
wonderful, you might have seen a copy of a wonderful New Yorker cartoon of two miners mining coal in the middle of World War II, and they looked up, and one miner is saying, "My gosh, it's Eleanor Roosevelt." And she was down in the mine with the workers.
What other places did she go?
Oh, she traveled a lot with other friends and sometimes with family. She'd go really any place that she was fascinated by. She'd go to not only to mines but to a lot of other kinds of places where she liked to square dance. You know, square dancing.
Yeah.
And she liked to square dance and did went to some places and would dance through the night with friends and people who lived wherever she was. So she really enjoyed life.
And so I heard your mom was close to um, her father when he started to get sick and helped him through those final years. So I heard a story about you remembering Yalta, the meeting that was about the ending World War II.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
you had a sore throat and your mom wasn't there,
Yes.
she was in Yalta. So was it when the nurse rushed in to turn off the radio, like you said?
Yes.
Were
Right.
you Did you know something was the matter, even if you didn't know what? Because people don't just rush into rooms and shut off radios.
Right. Exactly. I think I
So
may
did
have.
you suspect it, or were you too little to?
I I I really don't think I expected it. I mean, I certainly didn't expect it before I heard it on the radio, but but I think even afterwards, as I said, it took a visit. My grandmother stayed in Washington and didn't go with FDR to Warm Springs where he died, and so I came to know that he had died, but I really was too young to have a clear sense of the meaning. He'd been president I mean, he's the only president in American history who'd been elected four times, for 4-year terms. And
And after him, they made a rule that it was only 2 years.
that's right. I think of that as sort of the constitutional amendment that we can claim responsibility for our family because that I think that people in Congress and elsewhere were not prepared to have another 4-term president of the United States.
Right. And what were so like now? There's a lot of things happening in the world, like
Yes.
a lot of stuff. And
Yeah.
are there any things from Eleanor Roosevelt that you learned that can that are like words of wisdom that you learned?
Mm, mm. That's a wonderful question. I can't remember particular words, but the incident that you bring to my mind is um, when I was living with my grandmother in her home, either in Hyde Park or in New York City. On one occasion, I went to her in the morning, and I'd written a paper about the United Nations, and I said, "Grandmère, would you mind reading my paper and giving me some feedback about it. And she said so she'd be happy to. So that night I came home and I expected her, it was late, like midnight, and I expected her to be in bed, but she wasn't. She was signing signing letters, writing in, handwriting at the bottom of letters that had been typed for her by her secretary. And I said, we talked about the paper that I had written, and she said, Johnny, let's let me say that the writing that you do reminds me a lot of the writing of your father. And it was so meaningful for me because my father had died about 8 years before, and I so missed him that I'd been hungry for his presence, and that she would have an intuition of that, and know that I really wanted to hear about my dad. And so she said, let me put my my other work aside, and just the two of us go and sit down in front of the fireplace, and I'll tell you about your father. And it was such a incredible gift of her to recognize that, and to tell me then that the dad that I had really missed for those 8 years, um, was a person that she'd loved, um, and uh, and just cared for enormously. So that's the kind of wisdom, the sort of family wisdom that I remember her most for. There were other times where when she was older, that that I remember too, but like the times when she invited to come to the White House, um, a singer, an African American singer named Marian Anderson, and Marian Anderson was a beautiful soprano singer, but an organization that my grandmother was a member of called the Daughters of the American Revolution, um, said, no, we can't have an African American come and sing in our special hall. My grandmother said, well, if that organization, first of all, I'm going to resign my own membership from that organization, but I'm going to invite Marian Anderson to sing at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. And she gave the most extraordinary. This was about the time, this was before she and I knew each other well, but I'll always remember that kind of giftedness that that was hers, and things she would do for other people.
Wow. Thank you so much, Grandpa John.
Oh, I'm very happy to. This was such a pleasure for me.
I love this. It was so nice.
Yes, me too. Well, take care, Paloma. And anytime you have other questions, I'd love to talk about either of them with you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.